Okay, so get this right. Today's deep dive, we're going deep, really deep.
Deep dives are our specialty.
That's right. But this one's, well, let's just say it's a sinker. We're diving into this excerpt, the bell curve, and the recognition of truth and logos.
Catchy time.
I know, right? Sounds a little intense maybe, but stick with us. This article, it's like a brain workout, gets you thinking about intelligence, truth, how they all fit into like the structure of society.
And you know what's really interesting to me? The author, they connect all of this to self-improvement. Like everyone, no matter where they come from, can always be bettering themselves.
It's true, right? Everyone loves a good self-improvement story.
Yeah.
But this author, they're not talking about reaching some kind of like perfect state.
Oh, yeah, I see that. They even tell this story about a colleague of theirs. This person, they face some real difficulties in life, maybe even, what some might call a mental... Still wanted to work, still wanted to contribute.
And that really stuck with me.
It really highlights that idea that the journey, the effort, that's what matters, not some imaginary finish line.
Exactly. And that ties into like perfectly with their whole stance on truth.
Yep.
A big deal in this article.
Definitely.
Okay, ready for this? The author, they're all about presenting truth, but like super clearly and rationally, almost like, I don't know, a math problem.
Interesting.
They think if you lay it all out, the truth, so it's just undeniable, then even the biggest skeptics out there, they'll come around.
So truth is objective, that's what they're saying.
It's a bold statement, that's for sure.
It makes you wonder, though, is truth really that cut and dry? What about our own experiences, our biases, even just our own opinions? Don't those shape how we see things?
You're totally right. It's like, what even AS truth? Go down that rabbit hole. You might be there a while. But I have to admit, there's something kind of refreshing about the author's confidence, They even go so far as to say that when we face those uncomfortable truths head on, it's tough, I know.
I feel that.
But they're saying it actually brings you more peace of mind in the long run.
More than just ignoring those things that don't quite line up, right? That cognitive dissonance, that's what they call it.
Okay, so break it down for us. What's cognitive dissonance when it's at home?
Basically, it's that, like, mental discomfort you get when you're holding on to two beliefs that clash.
Ooh, I feel that.
For example, you love animals.
Right.
Right. But you also really enjoy a good burger.
This struggle is real.
That tension, that's cognitive dissonance.
Mhm.
Our brains, they don't like that.
Conflict avoidant kings and queens.
They're always trying to smooth things over.
Find a workaround.
Exactly. But the author, they're saying, facing those tough truths, even if it's uncomfortable at first, that's how we grow, become more self-aware, maybe even just feel mentally healthier.
Like ripping off a Band-Aid.
Exactly. It stings at first, but then the healing can begin. And speaking of conflicting ideas, the author then goes on to introduce this whole other concept, the masses versus the elites.
And that, my friends, is where things start to get a little spicy. This isn't your mama's self-help book anymore.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
The author, they draw these very sharp lines between these two groups. And a big part of it is about who has access to this truth we've been talking about.
So what's the deal with these masses? Who are they, according to our author?
Well, to put it bluntly, they seem to suggest that the masses are, well, kind of compliant,
Compliant.
happy to go along with the rules, the norms, whatever those in power set, without really questioning the why behind it all.
So they're not necessarily like evil or anything, just maybe a little passive, going with the flow.
Precisely. And this whole difference in access to the truth, it feeds directly into the author's next point. This is where things get really interesting.
Oh, I'm hooked. Tell me more about these elites and what they're all about.
So the elites, they're not exactly your typical one percenters, although I'm sure there's some overlap there. But according to the author, these elites, they're the ones calling the shots, shaping the narratives. They set the standards for, well, how everyone else should think and act.
Okay, so we're talking about like thought leaders.
Yeah.
Influencers of the mind.
You got it. And they have access to a lot more information. Maybe even more importantly, they have more influence over how everyone else interprets that information.
That makes sense. But where do the masses fit into all of this? And what about this whole education as programming idea?
Ah, yes. That. This is a very provocative concept.
It does sound kind of intense.
What the author's arguing is that modern education, instead of empowering people, it actually conditions them to do the opposite, suppress their natural instincts. And then they start relying on external sources, other people, to tell them what's right and wrong.
Hold on. Are you telling me all those years in school, my teachers were just, what, undercover agents programming me?
Well, not exactly.
I knew that library smell was sus.
But really what the author's getting at, I think, is that there's a real danger in suppressing our natural instincts. If we become too reliant on what others tell us to think and believe, we lose something.
I can see that.
They even use this interesting example. It's about children's reactions to homosexuality.
Okay, now that's an example I need to hear more about. Give me the concrete details to help me understand this whole programming thing.
So picture this, right? Young kids, they see something like a same-sex couple showing affection. The author says these kids, often their first reaction, it's like a gut instinct, disgust.
Yeah, okay, I see where you're going with this. And just to be clear, they're not saying that's a good reaction.
Right. Not at all.
Yeah.
The point is, it's like an unfiltered response. They haven't learned to react differently yet.
Right, right.
But then they compare that to older kids.
Yeah.
Kids who've been through the education system, right?
Yeah.
Those kids, much more likely to have the, politically correct, accepting response.
The one we've, come to expect.
Exactly. And the author's point is, are those responses really genuine? Or are they more about social conditioning? Have they just learned what they're supposed to think?
Wow. Okay, that's a really interesting way to look at it. It makes you wonder, are we really teaching kids to think for themselves or just what to think?
It's a big question. And this whole thing, it kind of opens up that whole can of worms about nature versus nurture, right? Are we born with certain ways of thinking? Or is it all about how we're raised, the environment we grow up in? No easy answers there.
Not at all. Okay, so we've got the masses, maybe a bit too comfortable with how things are, and the elites potentially pulling the strings. What happens next? Where does the author take us from here?
This is where it gets even more interesting. They say that the folks most likely to see through all of this programming, it's the people at both ends of the intelligence spectrum.
Hold on, wait. So you're saying the people who are, the least likely to agree on anything, they're the ones who see the truth. How does that even work?
It's a fascinating idea. So on one hand, you've got folks with less formal education, right? The author's argument is that they haven't been as exposed to the systems, the institutions that shape how everyone thinks. They haven't necessarily internalized those messages in the same way.
So they're coming at it with a fresh perspective, less baggage.
Exactly. And then on the other end, you've got the highly intelligent. They're able to really analyze information, spot the inconsistencies. They see the connections that other people miss and draw their own conclusions.
They're not afraid to question things, even if it makes waves.
Exactly. So they're both kind of like intellectual rebels in a way, each forging their own path, even if it's for totally different reasons.
I like that, intellectual rebels. And the author even points to dissident movements as a real-world example of this, right? They often attract both really smart folks, intellectuals, and also working-class individuals. It's like they're both drawn to anything that challenges the way things are. Okay, I can see that. But this whole idea that some groups are just naturally more likely to see the truth, it feels a little shapy to me. A little, I don't know, maybe even dangerous.
That's a really important point. It is a bit of a slippery slope. I mean, the author might be trying to highlight independent thought, which is great, but it could easily be twisted, Used to justify saying, oh, those academics are elitist and out of touch. Or, on the flip side, those people, they just don't know any better.
Exactly. And that kind of black and white thinking, that's what we really need to avoid. It's not about one group being right and the other wrong,
Definitely not. And I think the real value in what the author's saying, it's not about the conclusion, really. It's the questions they're raising.
It's like we're walking this tightrope, On the one side, we're saying, hey, maybe some people have better access to the truth, which, let's be real, feels kind of icky. But then there's this whole other side that's all about thinking for yourself, questioning everything, which I think we can all get behind. So how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's important to remember, I think, this is just one perspective, one way of looking at a very complex issue. We don't have to agree with everything the author says.
It's more about using their ideas to get us thinking, right?
Exactly. Like, here's the new way to think about this whole thing.
Oh, yeah.
One thing I noticed about the author, even though they're pretty critical of, the way society works, this mass manipulation idea.
Right.
There's also this real sense of compassion there, I think. It's not about blaming anyone.
More like trying to understand how we got here.
Exactly. And how can we do better, right? For everyone.
And that really comes through, I think. They're not saying, oh, those poor, clueless masses. It's more like, we're all in this together. We have a responsibility to fix it.
Right. And the author, they don't see anyone as being, inherently better than anyone else,
Mhm.
just that people who have different experiences, they see the world differently, and they have a responsibility to, I don't know, share those viewpoints,
Uh-huh.
help others break free from those limiting narratives.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But I gotta say, after spending all this time with this article, I'm still left with this big, like, nagging question. What if the author's right? Even a little bit. That all this stuff, our access to the truth, even our ability to think for ourselves, is shaped by things outside of our control. What does that even mean for us? How do
Well,
we build a society where everyone has a chance to, be their best selves no matter where they land on this intelligence spectrum? Honestly, it feels kind of hopeless.
I hear you. It's a big question. It can feel daunting, right? But I actually think there's a lot of hope in asking that question. The fact that we're even having this conversation right now,
Mm.
that we're wrestling with these ideas, seeing the problems in our systems, that's huge. That's how change happens.
So, where do we go from here? What's the takeaway for our listeners who are probably just as fired up, maybe a little overwhelmed as I am right now?
I think the key is, like, approach all of this with an open mind. Don't be afraid of those uncomfortable truths, even if they make you question everything you thought you knew. And never underestimate the power of, actually talking to each other. With empathy, we need to create those spaces where people from all walks of life can come together, share their experiences, really listen to each other. That's how we find common ground. That's how we build a better future. I really believe that.
You always have a way of bringing it back around to hope. It's a gift.
Well, I do believe that even the toughest, most challenging ideas, they can lead to positive change if we're willing to really sit with them with open hearts and open minds.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. Listeners, we know this was a lot to take in. Hit us up on social media. Let us know what you thought, what resonated with you, what challenged you. Keep those conversations going. And until next time, stay curious, everybody.